Before the lights, before the chants and belts and banners, there was silence, a kind of hush that clings to early hours and aching questions no child should know. The kind of silence that wraps itself around a heart like fog, tender but unyielding in those first years of breath, before words found their shape. Ronda Rousey lived in that silence. She was born into a slowed world, Riverside, California, February 1st, 1987, the last child of a family sewn together by triumph and bruised by sorrow. At birth, her umbilical cord had wrapped tight around her neck, life entering already gasping for air. The doctors warned her parents that oxygen loss had impaired her ability to speak. Apraxia of speech, they called it. A motor disorder. She could understand words, but when she tried to form them, only fragments came out. Some days, none at all. A war between thought and mouth. In those earliest years, she lived as a watcher, listening, observing. Her mother and Maria understood something that others didn't. The silence wasn't a void. It was a waiting, and Maria herself had learned to speak with her hands long before her daughter was born, with gestures honed from judo throws and world titles. She'd become the first American woman to win gold at the World Judo Championships. In 1984, she understood broken rhythms, understood fighting what cannot be seen. And so, in the quiet spaces between Ronda's failures to pronounce syllables, her mother waited with an intimacy that is only born from hardship. Her father, Ron Rousey, was gentle in the way fathers of loud homes often aren't. But this was not a loud home. Not really. There was care, yes, laughter, sometimes, but there was also an edge to it, a sliver of unease in the spaces between sentences. When Ronda was just 8 years old, that silence changed forever. Her father, suffering from a degenerative spinal condition, took his own life. The exact notes of that event are faded across time, like handwriting washed in rain. But the sadness it left became a cornerstone, the type you build character around, whether you want to or not. How does a child pass suicide? Not with logic, not with language, only with the echoes. Ronda wouldn't speak full sentences until she turned 6, and even then, her voice trailed behind her thoughts like wind behind a falling leaf. But in grieving her father, something hardened inside her. Maybe she couldn't explain her pain, not then at least, but she could absorb it, could refine it into something closer to grit. Judo became both inheritance and escape, not because she wanted to follow in someone else's footsteps, but because in judo the body speaks even when the mouth cannot. Her mother trained her early, just on tatami mats or inside gym walls, but in life, no leniency granted, no praise that wasn't earned. It was love, but sharper than most children could understand. And in that sharpening, a weapon began to take shape. She grew up small for her age, slender, awkward, with a wiry intensity in the eyes. Other sports rejected her. Her coordination wasn't elegant, but on the mat, under the watch of her mother's surgeon eyes, she learned control, learned to pivot her center of gravity like a pendulum striking its mark. And Maria did not coddle. If Ronda cried, she was told to wipe her face and get back to work. If she lost, she replayed every detail until her next match. Harsh, perhaps, but not heartless. Think of a dojo at night, its lights humming, the smell of sweat soaked into canvas. Outside, the snow settles over the trees like a lullaby, thick and slow. Inside, a teenage girl repeats the same throw hundreds of times, bones aching. There are no crowds, No belts or payouts or beltline advertisements, just echoes and the discipline of being unseen until you're ready. These are the years people forget when they see the spotlight. These are the hours Ronda Rousey was made. She began competing seriously by age 11. Regional events, then nationals, then beyond. Her teenage years were a blur of departure gates and baggage carousels. The US Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs became home, then Wakefield, Massachusetts, where snowstorms and solitude shadowed daily routines like cold companions. There were bruises beneath sleeves, hunger behind protein bars, exhaustion in every handshake. But she was rising in 2004. At just 17, she qualified for the Summer Olympics in Athens, the youngest judoka in her weight division. She didn't win, lost early. But losses have a way of etching deeper when seen through the eyes of a child who's only ever known struggle. No tantrums, no grand displays of frustration. Just that same vow in the mirror: do better, be better. Onward, much would come later. Medals, fences, crossed between sport and spectacle. But in these early stages, framed in silence, stared down by absence, the mythology hadn't yet taken form. She was not rowdy Ronda, no chance yet, no belts. Just a girl who learned to fight before she learned to speak. And through it all, the fragile threads of love and loss stitched the foundation: a father's void, a mother's iron, the nights no coaches see, the bruises earned in quiet. This is the stone before it's carved, the sound before the echo. This is the story of Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey did not enter the world gently, and it did not return the favor. Her earliest years unfolded like the slow flicker of light beneath a thick curtain, faint, unsure, interrupted by shadows. But in that space, she learned to adapt. Beneath silence, a second language began to bloom. Her world was shaped not by what she could say, but by what she could endure. Apraxia defined the rhythm of her childhood. It wasn't simply difficulty speaking, it was watching words pass through. Her mind like water through cupped hands, helpless to grasp them before they disappeared. Other children asked questions, offered answers, told stories. Ronda remained still, grasping at syllables that never quite came. Children like her are often labeled problematic, delayed, but she rarely saw herself that way. Nor did her mother, Anne Maria. Damas was no stranger to struggle. Long before she guided her daughter through the wilderness of early childhood, she had carved a path of her own, earning a PhD while raising children, becoming the first American woman to win a gold medal. At the World Judo Championships, she wore hardship like armor and passed it down like heirloom steel. In Anne Maria's eyes, obstacles weren't barriers, they were invitations. Invitations to fight smarter, harder, better. And Ronda, she learned at her mother's knee how to embrace that kind of gritted apprenticeship. They were not a conventional family. The dinner table echoed with stories of endurance, not small talk. Education and determination were sacred. From an early age, Ronda grew to understand that value was something made, not given. Every expectation leveled on her came wrapped in fire, and she was expected to meet it, no excuses. When tragedy cracked into her young life, it didn't ask permission. Her father, Ron Rousey, had always been the warm light in the house, the gently joking presence beside the strict discipline of Anne Maria. But injuries and illness don't measure their blows. A degenerative spinal condition began eating away at Ron's mobility, then his spirit. The man who had once thrown Ronda playfully through the air now needed help tying his shoes. And when the pain buried itself too deep to outrun, He chose to exit the world altogether. Ronda was just 8. In that kind of grief, time doesn't march forward. It loops. It echoes. She told herself the truth of it in fragments, before sobbing herself quiet and returning to the tatami mat. She couldn't process his absence in language yet, but she managed to carry it in posture, in gaze, in every stubborn refusal to show weakness. Many children would have crumbled or at least shrunk beneath the weight. But Ronda moved forward as if caught in a current stronger than herself. Judo became her lifeline. Her prayers were formed in throws and falls, not whispered words. On the mat, she could be understood without the need for syllables. Movement replaced speech. Determination became fluency. By the time she reached her early teens, Ronda was rapidly maturing as a judoka. Her footwork had been forged in pain. Her balance had been trained to endure instability. On the surface, she still appeared quiet, even withdrawn. A slender girl with a perpetual scowl and eyes that rarely blinked. But beneath that quiet lay a growing fire, a need to win, not for glory, but for proof. Proof that the silence hadn't swallowed her whole. She began winning national juniors competitions with alarming regularity. She outworked, outscrapped, and outlasted her peers. The legacy of her mother wasn't a weight on her shoulders. Was a bar to be exceeded. And Maria, ever uncompromising, would not melt under sentimentality. She was known to critique Ronda's gold medal performances with the same neutrality as if they had been losses. You left yourself open, you're leaning too far forward. Ronda absorbed it all, like concrete slowly setting. Those teenage years felt more like a mission than a phase. Judo was everything. There were no dances, no parties, no lazy weekends. There were tatami mats across the country, and later, the globe. Ronda's fingerprints became calloused and her elbows bruised. Her friendships were forged through sweat and shared fatigue. Sometimes she slept on gymnasium floors. Sometimes she cut water, weight with a plastic suit, and a starvation diet. Fighting dizziness in the faces of upcoming matches. There are those who chase dreams with hopeful optimism. Then there are those who run because they don't know anywhere else to go. For Ronda, the goal wasn't just the Olympics, it was survival. Making herself undeniable at 15. She moved to the US Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, a high-altitude crucible where adolescent illusion melts quickly into adult realism. She shared dorms with older girls who were harder, hungrier, more jaded, and yet she persisted. A wraith in the mountains, waking before sunrise, stretching in silence, pushing herself until her heartbeat felt like a war drum. She trained alongside elite athletes, passed them, beat them, lost to them, avenged herself, endured injuries, watched friends break their backs and walk away. But she carried on, not because she dreamed of medals, but because there was nowhere else to go, no second path, no backup. Dream, win, or disappear. Everything became a metric. Body weight, match times, recovery intervals. Between 2001 and 2003, she racked up victories at international junior tournaments. Her name began to pass across federation desks. Coaches took notice. Commentators began to murmur. Something was happening. A quiet storm building force. Then, in 2004, at just 17, she qualified to represent the United States at the Summer Olympics in Athens. It was a staggering achievement. No American judoka that young had ever reached the Olympic tatami. Her teammates were in their mid-20s. She arrived in Greece, wide-eyed, sunburned, nervous under her hoodie. The weight of the flag folded into her luggage. she lost, it was not a tale of victory. Her Olympic debut ended in an earlier round defeat. No fairy tale climax, just a long plane ride home and a soul that felt 10 pounds heavier. But the loss did something extraordinary. It didn't break her. It informed her, woke something up. She returned more dangerous. The following years were marked by an obsession. She would not fail again. She would not squander the one language. She finally spoke fluently combat. By the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, she had transformed again. Less teenager, more tactician, coiled with confidence. She fought fiercely through the brackets, knocking down decorated champions. She lost. In the semi-final, not gold, not even silver, but she secured bronze. The first American woman to ever win an Olympic medal in judo. She stood on the podium, hearing a national anthem played for someone else's flag. Her medal, bronze, shone against her chest like a kind of fulfilled prophecy, partial but real. Not perfection, but completion. And yet, it didn't fix her, didn't lift the ache. There had been no confetti, no endorsement deals, no parades waiting back home, just exhaustion and questions. Because Ronda was still only 20-1, and the question ringing louder than all others was, now what? Judo was her lifeblood, but it had also become an endpoint. After 19 years on the mat, after her Olympic climb and bronze pause, she found herself untethered. There was no logical next step inside the sport, no roadmap. Her body craved rest, her soul something else, so she stopped, walked away from Olympic judo, quietly packed her bags and returned not to lights or cameras, but to a trailer in Venice Beach. She slept on a mattress on the floor, worked sporadically as a bartender, waited tables, ate what she could afford, trained to feel alive. But without a competition nearby, it felt like going in circles. She was, for a time, anonymous, and for someone whose whole life had been framed in single elimination brackets and weight divisions, it felt like vanishing. But the fire remained. The hands still remembered every grip. The instincts still flickered behind the eyes, like a dormant engine. She would not stay dormant forever, because silence had always been her first language, and now she was listening again, for the sound of a challenge knocking on the far side of fate. Ronda Rousey did not so much return after the 2008 Olympics as drift. Her torso carried bronze like a lingering echo, but her spirit was unmoored. For 19 years, judo had been her meaning. Now, it offered little more than reflection. She was 21, directionless, suspended between a former identity and a vague, unshaped future. There was no victory tour. No victory, really. Only a podium with someone else at the top and a long, quiet walk off the mat. She had given judo her adolescent sand in return. It had both made her and emptied her. Bronze wasn't failure, not really. It was testimony. But when the off switch came, it came without warning. She simply stepped away. For a while, she lived minute to minute. In Los Angeles, cheap apartments sat beneath the glare of burnt-out street lamps. Occasionally, home was the back of her beat-up car. She waited tables and bartended when no one recognized her. That Olympic bronze medal, it sat in a drawer, half-dented from childhood curiosity. Once displayed, then ignored. It hadn't paid rent or bought groceries. Still, her body could not forget the dance. The mechanics of 1,000 throws haunted her muscles. Some days, she'd find herself shadow fighting alone on an empty beach, the sand giving way beneath every quick pivot and lunge. It wasn't training anymore. It was instinct, boiled down to a rhythm, looking for a song again. Then, Mama. She'd seen it on television. Fights with names she barely knew. Women pounding each other with fists, dragging combat across cages, and finishing with blood-slick arms raised in primal triumph. It wasn't elegance. It wasn't the measured art she had trained in, but it was raw, real, and inside it, she saw something disturbing and magnetic, a place where pain paid differently. She began training quietly, not with declarations or media, just late nights in makeshift gyms, relearning how to strike, to grapple without GI, to twist open-door judo into a new beast entirely. She was not good at first. Her punches lacked pedigree. Her kicks were stiff, but she could endure more than that. She could transform mistakes into lessons with ferocity rarely seen. 3 amateur bouts followed. All won, all within the first round, all by armbar. It became her signature before it was even strategy, like breathing, a move that lived inside her bones. And soon, people were noticing. Her transition into the professional MMA scene felt less like a debut and more like an arrival, long overdue. Promoters, analysts, and fighters began repeating her name not gently, but with caution. Rousey, they said, as if speaking of a storm still taking shape. Her first pro fight lasted 25 seconds. The second, 25 again. The third finished in half a minute, perhaps less. All arm bars, each time a surgical elbow isolation, leverage, tapped. She was aggression wrapped in poise, always moving forward, not reckless, but relentless. In MMA, where chaos prevails, she brought a new kind of calculation, controlled violence. She called herself a slow-twitch athlete, disguised as fast-twitch, methodical but unyielding. Then came Strikeforce, bigger stage, deeper pool. She signed on with a calm smile and fists already trembling to be used. Her first opponent, Sarah Delalio, never made it out of the first minute. Another armbar. So fast, so precise, it was like a magician's trick. Now you fight. Now it's over. Next came Julia Budd. Another defeat so swift people blinked and missed it. Her judo background began to show, not just in moves, but in placement. Where others scrambled, she flowed. Where others lunged, she redirected. She turned the cage into tatami, behind those chain-link walls. But it wasn't until she met Miesha Tate that the myth began to take root. Tate, the reigning Strikeforce bantamweight champion, was a veteran, confident, tough. She had fought through blood and grit, built herself into a decorated athlete. She was not afraid of Rousey, thought her hype inflated. A one-move pony, their build-up to the fight brimmed with venom. Sharp words, stare-downs. Rousey, never apologetic, told reporters she would break Tate's arm if she had to. Those weren't empty threats. They were forecasts. March 3rd, 2012. Rousey made weight and walked into the arena like a ghost dressed in fury. She exchanged early fists with Tate, then twisted the cadence of the fight, clamped down, dragged the bout sideways. An arm wrangled. Tate refused to tap at first. A crack, audible and sickening. Finally, the tap came, but long after the damage had been done. The MMA world paused, not just for the brutality, but for how clinical it all felt. Rousey rose from the mat, not with noise, but with focused breath, eyes distant. This wasn't showmanship, it was purpose. From there, everything accelerated. Fame seeped in like floodwater. Dana White, the polarizing, Explosive UFC president had once sworn that women would never fight in the UFC now. He called Rousey the future, not a future, the future. She became the first woman signed to the organization. Bantamweight division. Born with her name filling every corner of the announcement. Her nickname, Rowdy, a tribute to pro wrestler Roddy Piper, whose blessing she humbly received, began to circulate like legend. But it wasn't the bravado that kept people watching. It was inevitability. An approaching wave no one could stop. In interviews, she was sharp, a surgeon with syllables. Sarcastic, clever, biting. A media darling with the heart of a killer. She posed for magazines, appeared in films, attended late-night interviews, but never stopped training. Never forgot the throws. Her UFC debut was scheduled for February 23, 2013, against Liz Carmouche. In press conferences, she looked aloof, pressed her lips, played it cool, but inside she held terror, private tears, the weight of breaking barriers. Never settled comfortably. She felt it like chainmail beneath skin unseen, heavy. Still, she entered the cage. Lights, chants, cameras, the world watching. Liz Carmouche came ready, fought hard, took Ronda's back early and threatened to unlatch. The first page of a tragedy. But Ronda twisted free, reset her posture, and within 4 minutes and 49 seconds, the story returned to its chorus. The armbar tap she had survived. More than that, she had begun. Her victories weren't just fast, they were poetic, brutal. Poetry, yes, but poetry nonetheless. Each fight a stanza, each opponent a metaphor. Some feared her, others hated her, but none ignored her, and in that brutal ascent, amidst autographs and sleepless flights and endorsement deals emerging from nowhere, Ronda Rousey became something both terrifying and dazzling. Unavoidable, her face shaded magazine covers. Her stare unwavering and glassy was carved into pop culture. And across gyms, small-town newspapers, and living rooms once untouched by women's fighting, daughters began asking, "Who is she?" The answer was never just one thing. She was a torn ligament and a front-page headline. She was silence grown. Teeth. She was a scar turned sharp. A storm disguised as discipline. And she was far from finished. Because, for all the noise now building around her, she still hadn't lost. She was the only name on the lips of promoters that seemed to echo louder with every passing month. Ronda Rousey, no longer just whispered in gyms or murmured among fighters. Her name was now spoken with curiosity, then respect, and soon fear. The acceleration was dizzying, but for her it felt overdue. She hadn't clawed her way through discipline and devastation for applause. But now that it found her, she met it with that oddly calm demeanor a predator, already locked into pace. Official Strikeforce title defense against Sarah Kaufman was designed as a litmus test. Kaufman was talented, experienced, riding a wave of wins, the kind of opponent meant to challenge, to disrupt the myth. But within under a minute, the armbar was back. Of course, it was. Her signature maneuver came not with flair, but with finality. It ended careers, derailed plans, and she walked away, not boasting, but barely speaking. Her expression unreadable, as if she'd merely checked off another day in a long foretold script. It was no longer just the performances, it was the aura. Rousey fought like a ghost of inevitability, trailing anticipation before every bout. Opponents psyched themselves out before the cage door even shut. She walked into the arena upright, unreadable, but with silent warfare rolling beneath. Every glance, That quiet tension held more menace than roars. Her movement was not like the others. Where some bounded in with raw kinetic bursts, she folded space around herself. Her judo background laced each transition with balance invisible to many. It wasn't only submissions, it was schooled violence. Any opening became an unraveling. Watching Ronda fight was like watching gravity manifest. A pull too precise to resist. And then one night, Dana White, infamously adamant that women would never fight inside the UFC, went back on that proclamation. She was the reason. One fighter had shifted his certainty. If there's going to be one, he said, it's her. Not just a division, not just a card, a new chapter. And her name would write the first line. The UFC didn't just sign her, they etched her into its chronology. Ronda Rousey became the first woman to ever hold a UFC belt. No match had even been fought, yet she was UFC Women's Bantamweight Champion. Before touching canvas, it was less ceremony, more prophecy. Everyone just nodded, largely agreeing, yes, it should be hers. And so UFC 157 was born. There would be no easing in. Ronda would headline, sharing the marquee with Dan Henderson and Lyoto Machida. She would face Liz Carmouche, a Marine veteran, tough, capable, unshaken by hype, and more importantly, unafraid. The lead-up dripped with press commitments, not fights. But Ronda handled it the same way she had always done, with clipped confidence and subtle deflections. She rarely volunteered vulnerability, but under the surface, pressure clawed her ribs. She would be the first. If she failed, maybe the last. Fight night came hard and cinematic. The cameras swept over the crowd. Celebrities packed front rows. There was an electricity that buzzed even under muted lights, as if the future hung breathless but wary. Carmouche looked charged, steady. Ronda, the same glassy intensitile, like she'd seen this all once before in a dream. Too quiet to wake from. What people didn't expect was how close Carmouche came to shocking history. Moments into the fight, Carmouche leaped on Ronda's back mid-scramble, wrapped her neck, twisted tight. For a split heartbeat, it looked over. A potential collapse before the coronation. The crowd's scream warped from celebration to panic. Ronda grimaced, her face stretched in visible pain, and yet she didn't tap. She shifted, rattled her shoulders, dragged Carmouche through each moment, breath measured like a diver underwater. Then, from almost being choked into darkness, she twisted, adjusted hips, and the armbar returned. For minutes and 49 seconds, a gasp, a tap, a win, she survived her greatest trial. Her reign had begun, but this time it was different. This wasn't Strikeforce anymore. This was the UFC, the pinnacle. The world's eyes were now not only watching, but scrutinizing. She had opened the door, and now everyone wanted a piece. The division filled quickly. Former friends became rivals. Spectators became commentators. Each bout a headline. Each training slip a rumor. Her second UFC bout reignited the grudge match with Miesha Tate. Their animosity had fermented, sharper now under the glow of media and attention. Tate smiled through photo ops, but promised violence in interviews. Rousey, she offered truth, not charm, fire, not finesse. Their bout was prolonged compared to her Norm Tate, refusing to crumble quickly, but by the third round, another armbar finished the record. Then came Sarah McMahon, Alexis Davis, Kat Singh, Beatty Correia. Each name offered up, like sacrifice. Each camp warned of strategy, of new angles, of deeper preparation. But none could slow her. McMahon folded under a knee to the liver, dropped like a marionette with her strings cut. Davis succumbed in 16 seconds, one of the fastest finishes in UFC history. Zingano attempted wild aggression, only to submit 14 seconds later. Correa, who mocked suicide and spat venom in pre-fight soundbites, was knocked out cold in 34 seconds. Her collapsed body echoing like punctuation before a stunned Brazilian crowd. These were not fights. They were exhibits. People began to ask if she would ever be beaten, if invincibility was a birthplace, if, perhaps, Ronda Rousey wasn't merely the best, but untouchable. Comparisons spread. Were these moments a level? Jordan level, was she? A generation's gladiator. Her face became marketable myth. Talk shows, photo shoots, commercials. She played herself in movies, did her own stunts, crafted her own mythos. Don't blink, warned commentators before her walks toward the cage. Yet beneath this orbit, stress fractured her quietly. She kept her schedule ruthlessly busy. Pain became background noise. Isolation, her chosen shield. Fame cracked the foundation, built through discipline. Not broken, not yet, but shaky. And the media, which once lifted her, began to prod corners of her public demeanor. Her confidence was spun as arrogance, her silence reinterpreted as coldness. A hero becomes a threat simply by not smiling enough. But she fought on. People knew. The wins by numbers now, 12-0, all by finish. Most within a minute. Championship belts stacked like armor beside stoicism. Her eyes, still sharp, never flicked toward mercy. And the armbar always, the armbar came like winters you couldn't stop. One limb locked, and the story ended, not easily. Not sweetly, but definitively. Quietly whispers began about who might stop her. For now, though, they remained just that, whispers, because Ronda Rousey still hadn't lost. And when she stood in the center of the octagon, hands raised, another challenger broken behind her, the air didn't cheer, it held its breath. The storm wasn't subsiding. Not yet. The moment she stepped into the octagon at UFC 157, history had already caught its breath. Ronda Rousey wasn't just fighting another opponent, she was fighting expectation, skepticism, precedent. Liz Carmouche had every reason to bow under the weight of it, but she didn't. She came bursting forward, fearless and tight-fisted, twisting herself onto Rousey's back like destiny might be rerouted by sheer belief. And for a flicker, it nearly was. Carmouche had the back. The neck was strained. The arm was slinking beneath Rousey's chin. There was a torque that seemed unforgiving. The crowd caught in one long inhale, but Ronda didn't panic. Her breathing never spiked. She peeled a limb, pried a hip, and uncoiled her posture with the calm of someone late for a meeting she knew she would still attend on time. 4 minutes and 49 seconds later, Carmouche was tapping. The arc bent back toward the narrative that would follow for years. Armbar, submission, inevitability. And with that, the UFC's first female headliner left the octagon with its first championship belt wrapped around her waist. But more than victory, she left with permission for 100 other women to dream in the octagon. Where once they were invisible, Ronda didn't look elated. She looked relieved. The noise lifted with her name. But inside, she knew. Now came the harder part, staying. She fought Miesha Tate again at UFC 168. Their rivalry had calcified by then, growing with every insult, every interview loaded with thin veneers and tight-lipped tension. Tate represented more than an adversary. She represented doubt. The idea that Ronda wasn't as untouchable as believed, that her rise might be smoke and timing. The fight went longer than most expected. Tate lasted into the third round, shrugged off early takedowns, landed a few of her own. But Rousey's tempo never slipped. Like a pendulum patiently waiting for the right hour to chime, she found her moment. Tate's elbow locked, and Rousey pulled. Another tap, another finish. The rivalry ended in Ronda's usual punctuation: painful, final, quiet. Then came Sarah McMahon, an Olympic silver medalist in wrestling. McMahon's credentials made headlines. A fighter strong enough, maybe heavy enough, in the right moments, to break Ronda's center of gravity. But the fight lasted barely a blink. One clean knee to the liver, that was it. A surrender of breath, a stagger, a collapse, and a referee stepping in. 66 seconds. McMahon could barely stand after the blow, and Rousey walked away again. No scream, no taunt. Her post-fight confidence sat somewhere between grim and casual-like. Someone making their bed after a restless night. Next, Alexis Davis, a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the kind of quiet contender built from fundamentals and resilience. Analysts suspected she could weather an early storm, maybe drag Ronda into later rounds. It never came to pass. In fact, few blinked fast enough to catch it. Ronda's hand found the clinch. A judo throw snapped Davis onto the canvas like a falling door. 3 blows, 16 seconds. It was over by now. Her entrances were folklore. Hand-wrapped fists, that vacant glare. Rogan whispering "don't blink" before her feet had even left the tunnel. The audience half believers, half hopeful for an upset, at on edge, caught between admiration and a growing sense that dominance had begun to strangle drama. Then came Kat Zingano, undefeated, wild, unorthodox. She ran forward, with a knee as the opening bell echoed. 1 second in, and she'd already closed the distance. Too quickly, Ronda twisted, spun, dragged, took the back, forced the arm under the neck and squeezed. Zingano tapped at 14 seconds. The fastest finish in UFC championship history. An apex predator, hiding tactical genius behind that steely exterior. People marveled, not just at the finishes, but at the polish. From underground sequences in the world of judo to center stage in the biggest MMA promotion in the world, Rousey hadn't just crossed over, she'd rewritten guidelines. There had never been anything like it. Men wanted her approval. Women wanted her crown. Children, watching with wide eyes, learned that collision and strength and certainty weren't just male inheritances. But dominance has its own cost. When Beatty Correa faced her, the mood shifted. Correa wasn't the most dangerous fighter Ronda had ever faced, but she might have been the most impudent. She baited with bravado, talked of making Ronda cry, mocked her mental health in interviews, scowled for promo posters. Like a character who hadn't read the final chapter of their own cautionary tale. Rio de Janeiro hosted the match. A deafening crowd roaring, "Vai morrer. You're going to die." Correa soaked it in. Ronda just stood there, composed, focused. The bell rang. 34 seconds later. Ronda stepped away from a collapsed Correa, the first knockout of Ronda's career. No submission, no armbar, just fists. A blunt conclusion. After the fight, Ronda didn't gloat. "Don't talk about my family," she said, her voice trembling slightly. That was all, with 6 consecutive UFC wins, all finishes. Titles defended, opponents broken, narratives punctured. But slowly, The pressure began to infect the pause. There was no time for failure, no room for error, no night off from myth-making. She began appearing in movies, blockbusters, playing into her persona. The Expendables 3, Furious 7, Entourage. She was drifting into the type of fame no other MMA fighter had known. Not even the most charismatic men had breached this level of cultural saturation. But what fame gives, it also takes. She was pulled in every direction. Training became part performance. Media wanted one version of her. Coaches needed another. Her identity split, then spun. Fighter, icon, actress, endorser, meme, hero, and villain. Whispers began to circle. Who could beat her? Not because anyone truly saw weaknesses, but because stories only extend so far before audiences crave rewrite, crave fall. It's old as myth. Olympians rise, and then they tumble. Thrones attract not just rust, but rebellion. Still, Ronda kept winning, with more precision, more fury. And as cameras closed in between rounds, shooting her expressionless stare, one could feel the edges tightening. It wasn't just the fighting anymore, it was everything. The commercials that demanded smiles, the interviews, stacked like dominoes, the weight of having to be first and having to stay first. She held it all, until she couldn't. But for that moment, for those bright, undefeated nights, the storm was still hers. And whenever she stood across from another woman, shoulder blades tight, eyes like flint, everyone knew this would end soon. Because Ronda Rousey, rowdy to some, but rainstorm to others, was still fighting like history depended on it. It began not with a crash, but with carefully coiled anticipation. UFC 193, Melbourne, Australia. The largest crowd in UFC history, over 56,000 voices, most of them waiting for confirmation that the champion in black and gold would remain untouchable. That Ronda Rousey, destroyer of seconds and breaker of limbs, would once again extinguish a challenger with surgical cruelty. Her opponent, Holly Holm, didn't match the storm with flash or fangs. She came quiet, measured, a professional boxer. A southpaw technician arriving at the altar of rousiness with calm reverence and a plan. Few noticed her stillness. Most believed she wasn't worth noticing. But if Ronda was force, Holly was form. What no one guessed, form would bend force tonight. From the opening bell, something was off. Ronda surged forward, like always, but her angles were jagged. Holm circled, jabbed, moved again. She wasn't there when Ronda arrived to land. And when fists missed, the crowd's roar dimmed into confusion. That Rousey could be made to miss in itself was jarring. Still, people clung to belief. Early skirmishes would lead to the takedown, the armbar, the inevitable. But it never came. Holm's rhythm was a blade slowly carving through the myth. One clean elbow here, a sidestep there. Each exchange pulling back the curtain on something unthinkable. Ronda wasn't winning. Worse, she looked lost. By the second round, the chants had become breathless pauses. Holm planted her feet, ducked under a wild right hook, and delivered a left straight that staggered Ronda. She stumbled, her foundation, built on years of absolute certainty, tottered, and then it happened. A left kick soared upward in a perfect arc, slamming into the side of Ronda's neck. Her head snapped sideways, her legs gave out, and she crashed backward, unconscious before she hit the ground. For several seconds, the stadium didn't cheer. It gasped. That sound, the impact, the silence got deeper than any of Holm's jabs. The Queen had fallen, not in controversy, not in drama, but decisively, publicly, undeniably. There were no defiant interviews afterward. There weren't even coherent ones. Ronda was rushed to the hospital with a shattered lip, a bruised ego, and a now fractured legacy. The internet exploded. Memes of her fall went viral within minutes. Commentators tripped over each other to say what hadn't been dared the day before, that maybe she was never that good, that maybe she had fooled us all. They forget that empires often look most permanent just before they collapse. Ronda disappeared. She didn't return a week later, or a month. The woman who couldn't be escaped suddenly withdrew from view like breath from a cold room. No interviews, no public training footage, just silence. Her Instagram went quiet. Sponsors fell back. Supporters turned reflective. Critics sharpened knives. Behind that curtain, Ronda wrestled with despair. Most would rather mythologize than understand. She later admitted she had wondered if living was still worth it, not because of a belt, because her identity had been inseparable from winning. And now that identity had cracked, her reflection held only questions. Her whole life had been about momentum, from trauma to tatami, from judo to cages, from silence to storm. But now there was stillness, and no map to walk her home. The foundation of her strength, this idea that suffering could always be turned into dominance, had met its match in a fighter who simply didn't believe the story. There were no grand comebacks that year, no plotted revenge. She healed quietly. Eventually, the conversation drifted, as time always insists it must. New fighters rose, new headlines, streaks began and ended. But Rousey remained an unfinished sentence until over a year later, when word broke she would return. UFC 207. Amanda Nunes, the reigning champion, would meet the former. The promotion clung to nostalgia. Posters turned Rousey's face into a fading icon. Promos fed off silence. Ronda gave no interviews, no appearances. Her training was private, tight-lipped. Even the weigh-ins felt somber. She walked into the arena like a statue moving through fog. Amanda, meanwhile, was grinning. From the first second, it was clear this wasn't a match. Nunes opened with combinations. Crisp, loud punches that landed with thuds one might expect in heavyweights. Ronda absorbed them with no answer. It was repetition without defense, fury meeting fragility. The referee stepped in just 48 seconds after the fight began. Ronda didn't hit the canvas, but she stood still, head turned, eyes lost while punches careened around her. It was worse than the home fight in some ways. There had been no resistance, no rematch, no reawakening, just finality. She left the cage, eyes wide, but pupils distant. Another hospital visit, another empty press conference, another withdrawal. And though fans still debated, deep down, everyone knew it was the last time. There was no retirement tour, no press release, just absence. Some mocked her exit, claimed she was never built for a real fight, forgot that dominance itself had redefined what women's MMA looked like, that for half a decade she was the reason the cages were even open. For others, but legacies are rarely read from the middle. Ronda faded from the octagon, slowly, gently, this time not from loss or fear, but from a decision to no longer bleed for validation. She had given her body, her voice, her identity, and now that identity needed to be rebuilt from somewhere safer. The fall came not from a single loss, but from the weight of having been everything, the first, the firstest, the face. And when she finally stepped away, it wasn't defeat echoing behind her, it was quiet. The door didn't slam shut after UFC 27. It swung slowly, quietly creaking on its hinges as Ronda Rousey stepped out. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't release a final word. No farewell tour or cage-side tribute montage. Only silence. A silence she had once grown up in and now returned to. In that void, something began to shift. Loss, in the beginning, was weight, but over time it became space, and space became choice. She retreated from the spotlight, entirely unplugging. Everything. No audio, no images, no commentary track over her next move. She returned home, physically and figuratively, to the only place that had never asked her to perform herself. For once, there was no weight class, no opponent, no clock, just breath. And the question that trails every burned-out myth. If she wasn't fighting, then who was she? Pain had followed her like a second skin. Now, under the California sun, she spent mornings not dissecting opponents, but walking barefoot through quiet, dusty trails. Nights weren't press conferences, were actual sleep. Still restless, yes, but uninterrupted. Somewhere in that stillness, the iron in her blood began to cool. She'd lived most of her adulthood with fists ready and jaw clenched. Now, her posture slackened, her gaze softened. Recovery wasn't her goal. Rebuilding was. It wasn't long before whispers stirred of a return, perhaps, but not to the cage, to the ring. World Wrestling Entertainment was spectacle over strategy, story over blood. But unlike most athletes crossing over from real fights to scripted ones, Ronda's transition didn't feel like retirement. It wasn't her stepping down, it felt like her stepping sideways, into an arena that didn't ask her to be flawless, just to be mythic. And she already knew how to do that. In early 2018, she appeared at the Royal Rumble event. No strikes were thrown, no boots laced, just an entrance, a stare. Her presence alone drew screams from a crowd that hadn't seen her for over a year, but hadn't forgotten. Around her waist was Rowdy Roddy Piper's old leather jacket, gifted to her by the late wrestler's family. A symbolic inheritance, not just a name borrowed. A torch passed. By April, she was in the ring at WrestleMania, sharing the stage with legends and veterans, and yet she didn't shrink. Her performance equal parts power and play electrified skeptics and fans alike. Headlines shifted from "Can she pull it off?" to "She belongs." Her judo throws, that signature hip rotation, found new life on the wrestling canvas. Punches pulled, scripts followed, but the fury still burned behind the eyes. WWE embraced her completely. She didn't enter as a novelty, but as a She claimed the Raw Women's Championship in August 2018 and held it for over 230 days, not just as a figurehead, but as a workhorse. She toured, she trained, she bled, this time accidentally scripted and occasionally real. Wrestling may have been choreographed, but Ronda gave herself to it with the same intensity she had given to judo and MMA. This wasn't a mask over her combat, past it was a reframing. Her aggression became theater. Her presence became narrative. The boos and cheers weren't a verdict, they were currency. And in this space, she wasn't required to defeat anyone, just to embody something larger than outcome. But within that performance, real transformation was happening. Outside the lights and pyro, her personal life was taking root. She had married Travis Brown, a fellow MMA fighter whose quiet strength mirrored her own. With him, she found not a corner man, but a calm, a kind of spiritual quiet she hadn't known since childhood. They built a home one designed not around cameras or cages, but cattle, soil, and sunrise, away from billion-dollar venues and locker room politics. Ronda discovered joy that didn't stem from finish bonuses or post-fight showers. She spoke about her animals, her garden, her sense of purpose, finally unhooked from metrics. In 2021, she welcomed her first child, daughter. The announcement bore none of the fanfare she was once accustomed to. Just a photo, a soft caption, no rage, no bravado, just a look in her eyes that spoke of protection, not performance. She wasn't unlearning the fighter inside her, she was reining it in, guiding its claws into softer earth. Motherhood didn't erase the competitor, but it re-architected her ambition. No longer was she chasing legacy on other people's terms. No longer was she climbing podiums to prove she could. She had already done more than most would in 5 lifetimes of grit. Now, her battles weren't public, they were daily and deeply private. A child's cry at 2 a.m., a fence to mend before breakfast, a quiet marriage that chose routine over pageantry. And yet, the performer inside her never fully vanished. In 2022, she returned to WWE, once again entering the Royal Rumble, this time post-childbirth, post-retreat, post-reinvention. The crowd roared, the chants returned, but they echoed differently now. Less hunger, more homage. She won the Rumble, headlined WrestleMania, recaptured a title. But even with a belt slung over her shoulder, she no longer resembled the hurricane who'd choked out a generation of challengers in MMA. She was calmer, not lesser, just. Complete by mid-2023, her appearances became more sparse. The fire hadn't gone, but it no longer consumed her. She appeared at independent wrestling events, chose her battles, stayed just close enough to feel connected, but far enough to protect what mattered now. She didn't need to be central anymore. Ronda Rousey, the fighter, the actress, the champion, the villain, the savior, had become something few expected. Human, and in that humanity, she found the rarest fight worth winning: peace. She doesn't walk out to applause anymore. There are no flashing bulbs, no verdicts scribbled at ringside, no countdowns to entrances or scrolling bottom screens tracking her next appearance. Her legacy now lives in silence, in glances past, between young fighters, in the voices of girls wrapping tape around their wrists, in dusty gyms where the first punch is still a prayer. Ronda Rousey, the name, doesn't need to arrive on a pay-per-view marquee to be known. It lingers, quiet, certain. She was never just the champion. She was the breacher, singular point from which the impossible became routine. Before Ronda, women's MMA hovered like a topic too serious for sport and too volatile for spectacle. After her, it was main event, title implications, billion-dollar divisions. She didn't open a door. She tore it off its hinges and dared anyone behind her to be timid, and they followed. Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko, Rose Namajunas, Juliana Pena, their presence today, their television slots and headline slots and fan bases, they carry her fingerprint, whether they acknowledge it or not. Not because Ronda was the most technical or the most durable, not because she remained at the top longest, but because without Ronda Rousey, they would be stepping into a spotlight that didn't yet exist. Her legacy doesn't decorate a museum wall or fit neatly in a statistic. It is found in ripples, in changed perspectives, in questions no longer asked, Can women really sell fights? Do people want to watch them? Ronda answered them the way only history's catalysts do, by never stopping long enough to hear them asked out loud. Yet for all her achievements, the story remains complicated. Some see a fighter who blazed too fast, burned too hard, then crumbled under impact. They dwell only on the final chapters, the defeats, the disappearance, the shift to the performance ring, as if the act of not staying forever at the top invalidates the climb she carved. But few legends remain undefeated by time, and even fewer change an industry in their failure. Ronda did both. She was an Olympian before she was a fighter, a trailblazer before she was a name. Her life was never lived at a casual pace. Each phase: childhood, judo, MMA, WWE. Motherhood was devoured with the same restless intensity of someone who feared complacency more than pain. Behind every record-breaking finish, every pay-per-view spike, there existed the same silent urgency, born from darker corners of her past, to never be forgotten, to matter before memory bent her toward myth. And yet, myth found her anyway. Now, years away from title fights and press rows, she doesn't seem to chase relevance. Her story pulses not with desperate returns or last-minute revivals, but with settled dust, as if the echoes of what she did are loud enough to carry forward without her shouting them. She became what many athletes never get the chance or permission to become. Post-legend, you'll see her now on the outskirts of the story. A podcast interview here, a rare crowd pop there, holding her child in one arm and a smile, slightly humbled, in the other. She trains still not for war, but for wellness. The body that was once all weaponry is now one of memory. And maybe that's all she ever wanted in the end. For the roar to quiet, for the ache to settle. Her medals are not displayed on tour. Her belts don't travel from city to city behind velvet ropes. But every time a woman walks into a ring and believes the crowd will cheer her name, Ronda already won. Every arm that ends a title match, every young fighter backed by sponsors that once overlooked her, answers the question of legacy more clearly than any trophy. Because legacy isn't what you leave when you're praised. It's what remains when you're gone, Ronda. Rousey's story wasn't carved cleanly. It jagged its way through doubt and dominance, splintered across public perception, then faded into something more ethereal. She didn't retire with universal hugs or loving bows from critics. She left as she arrived unexpectedly, and perhaps that was her greatest rebellion. To fight not for permanence, but for the possibility she could create for others. Some will always remember her as the icon who fell, others, the icon who dared to rise at all. But for a small host of fighters scattered across the earth, today lacing their gloves, stepping into cages, hearing their names announced as the main event for them, Ronda isn't a cautionary tale or a chapter closed. She is the reason the story ever had a beginning. There is no final round in legacy, no bell that tells it to sit down, fade out, be still. It whispers on through generations, reshaping possibilities. Into norms, the octagon has held louder champions, perhaps even longer reigns, but their echoes will not travel the same contours. Ronda's sound was different. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't applause. It was the sudden hush that happens right before transformation. The kind of silence that demands attention. The kind that comes before history makes its move. And so, her legacy lives, not in decibels, but in resonance, in the small stillness before the first punch, in a child's voice asking who was the first, And in every quiet second after the shouting ends, when the lights go out and the world begins to listen, you can almost still hear her, if you know where to look, if you know when to listen. Sometimes, the loudest echoes come from the silence that follows the roar, and these are the whispers of the game.